Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar presented to you by Zycus and the Hackett Group. The topic for today's webinar is Trends Shaping the Future of Procurement, and the speaker for today is Patrick Connaughton, who is a Senior Research Director at the Hackett Group. So let me introduce you guys to Mr. Patrick. Patrick leads the development of Hackett's intellectual property in the areas of strategic sourcing and procurement. He has over 15 years of experience in supply chain and procurement research and has published groundbreaking research on spend analysis amongst others. I will now like Patrick to continue with the presentation for today.
Okay, thanks very much, and welcome to the webcast on the Trends Shaping the Future of Procurement. We're recording today's session, so for the few people that may have attended yesterday's session, there will be a little bit of duplicate content in the beginning, but we'll focus more towards the end again, so please bear with us. So let's get started. I am the research director for the team at the Hackett Group, and the Hackett Group is a research and advisory firm. We do a lot of primary research, and a lot of what we're presenting today is based on our interviews and the research that we've done in our procurement and sourcing practice. So let's get started. Let's jump right into it. Now, when we think about what's happening out there in the world, we talk about this digital imperative. We talk about how things are rapidly changing, these 5 forces of change: disruptive innovation, the insight imperative. And this catalyst, this digital catalyst for change, has made things happen a lot faster than it's ever happened before. And I use this example of Pokemon Go a lot, not just because it's been a huge success in the way that it's earned money, but because overnight, essentially, we have this new platform for marketing to people on the move, an entirely new microeconomy that's emerged around it. And so this is the type of change that as procurement and sourcing executives, we have to be prepared to react to much faster than we have in the past. Now, a lot's been written about the digital imperative, digital transformation, and the Hackett Group certainly didn't invent this. Here you can see on the screen a number of different books that have been written on this topic. My favorite is the one on the right, Digital Transformation, What You Should Have Done Yesterday. And I think that's how a lot of us feel as we think about the digital world and digital procurement. What should we have been doing yesterday? What should we be doing tomorrow? This is no longer coming up with a plan for the next 5 to 10 years. This is about coming up with a plan for the next 6 to 12 months. So there's been a lot written about this, but one of the things we found when we looked at the different frameworks out there is that they're very much focused on the end consumer, selling to the end consumer. And what we've done is we've reviewed a lot of these frameworks and distilled it down to some key pieces that we think you can leverage as more of a back office executive. How can we think about it from an IT, HR, procurement perspective in making things more digital? Now, this webcast is about future trends impacting procurement, but the point here is that digital transformation and the things that we do to react to it are really the key trends that we need to be thinking about. And so we're going to frame the conversation up around digital transformation and talk about some of the trends within that. So, an abstract of today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about our framework that we've put together for digital transformation. We're going to talk about the different components of it in the trends in that context. So what you see here is a much broader framework, and don't worry, I'm not going to walk through each piece of this, but at the Hackett Group, we're looking at how you develop a digital strategy and what capabilities are in place to support that digital strategy. Things like digital customer engagement, digitally enabled workforce, technology enablers. But what we've done for today's discussion is we've actually taken this and distilled it down for you. We've distilled it down to 5 key areas that we're going to talk about today. The first is along the bottom, insight-driven analytics. We think about analytics and data. This forms the foundation of what we want to do in the future. And then we have the 4 pillars of what we consider a digital business strategy. And each of these pillars in itself represents a major trend within procurement and sourcing. The first, an omnichannel personalized stakeholder experience. And stakeholder is in bold and italics there because in the frameworks that I talked about on the previous slide that were in a lot of those books that were consumer focused, it was all about creating a personalized consumer experience. Why can't we do that same thing for procurement and sourcing stakeholders? So we'll talk about that. The next area is a digitally enabled workforce. And so as much as we embrace technology, we have to make sure that people have the training and tools they need to take advantage of it. Next is a smart orchestration of source-to-pay services, and smart is in quotes because we talk about smart automation, robotic process automation. And the last area is an ecosystem of networked solutions, and I'll explain what that means when we get to that section. But it's essentially expanding on what we've talked about in the past, supplier networks, to include broader knowledge networks, and I'll explain what I mean there. So these are the pillars and the foundation of a digital strategy, and each one of these areas represents significant change and trends that we're going to need to react to as procurement and sourcing folks. So let's talk about the first area, a foundation of data and insight-driven analytics. Now, we all talk a lot about big data, and we talk about this transition from kind of reports that took weeks or days to generate that were really just static, rear-view mirror type reports, and moving into forward-looking, predictive type of analytics, and the continuum in between. And as part of that, being able to take advantage not only of your legacy databases, but information that's out there in the cloud, sensor data, social data, partner data. And how do we bring that all together to gain insights? And so one of the most significant trends impacting us is this idea of big data and how do we embrace it, but then how do we also cut through the noise to make better decisions? Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the left-hand side here, we actually asked our key issues study respondents, so every year we run a big survey for procurement and sourcing folks, and we asked them, we said, which trend will have the greatest transformational impact on the way you do your job in the next 10 years? And far and away, greater than any other trend out there, predictive analytics and forecasting tools was the biggest area that people felt was going to have the most transformational impact on the way we do our jobs. More so than changes in the global economy, cloud computing, mobility, enterprise social networking, all these other areas. And so this is a real trend that we need to focus on. Now, on the right-hand side here, you see a cover from a report that we wrote on spend analysis software. And it all starts with spend analysis in a lot of ways when we think about analytics and what we want to do. And then we go into broader market intelligence and category intelligence. And then once a contract is in place, we span into tracking supplier performance and thinking about risk and modeling risk. And so this is the big picture around predictive analytics and forecasting. A lot of times it's about better understanding commodity volatility, risk, maybe getting ahead of performance being degraded at a supplier and how you can plan for that. It could be environmental and supply chain and business continuity issues. And so this predictive analytics is one of the major trend areas and the foundation that we need to set to think about some of these other tools. Now, the first pillar in our framework and an area that a lot of folks are focused on is this building an omni-channel personalized stakeholder experience. We'll talk about what we mean by that. So here I've got a slide, and I talk about the Olympics, and I use this analogy a lot because when you think about the Olympics viewing experience today, you're able to go to your Comcast or your service provider, your cable service provider, to a single dashboard where you can link to events that are happening at the moment. You can filter by the different event that you want to see. You can also click on a link to go out to YouTube or other areas where you can view past events. You can set up a list of things you want to record. It's all in one place, and there's all these different mediums for how you can view and consume the Olympics. A very, very personal experience based on how you want to interact and learn and see what's happening. And this analogy holds true to how we interface with our procurement stakeholders too. How can we give them an experience that they can draw information the way that they want to consume it, whether it's during the workday, if it's in the middle of the night, if it's on a weekend, through the different channels that they might want to see it. And so this creation of this omni-channel experience is a big trend in the consumer world that we need to embrace in procurement and sourcing with our stakeholders. Now, there's a number of different ways to achieve this. We talk about creating this omni-channel experience, and it spans social, mobile, voice, and web. It requires having phone support, browser chat support, self-service, maybe communities that folks can log into and ask common questions. And it's a personalized experience. So when they do log into these tools, maybe there's a history of things you've looked at before. You know this person's role. You know the categories that they're interested in. So the takeaway here is that as we think about tools and technology and in what we're doing in the future, we want to make sure we're creating a consistent experience and a consistent brand around what procurement does with our stakeholders. And that brand carries through not only on the portals and the self-service apps, but also in the experience at the help desk, the experience on the phone. And so this is a really big trend that we're seeing, this movement towards a personalized multi-channel experience for our stakeholders. Now, kind of a bit of a sidebar here, but one way that companies are increasingly interfacing with not only consumers but stakeholders is this idea of a chatbot. And really what this is it's about taking away kind of browsers and apps, taking those out of the picture, and interfacing with your stakeholders via chat. If you think about this millennial generation, they're all about using text messages. It's, any other medium has pretty much gone away for a lot of folks, and they expect to be able to do this. And so the example here is 1-800-FLOWERS, where you can actually search through the catalog, make a purchase, ask questions, all via this chat box, similar to the way that you might interface with a web page. And so again, an example of how the channels, the way that people interface are changing. And if you're looking at how you're going to create maybe a new buying experience for your stakeholders, are you thinking about how you might use chatbots in that scenario? Now, as we continue to evolve here, it's not just about texting and this user experience, but we also see folks really eliminating typing altogether in some cases, presenting dashboards that allow for drag and drop capabilities. In the past, when we wanted to run analysis, and it might have required batch processing overnight or something installed on your actual machine or server, now we have business intelligence in the cloud, where that we can view on a tablet and slice and dice information and view it quickly. And so how are you going to take advantage of that? How does it change the way that you interface with data? One way it changes is that increasingly we talk to CPOs who have asked to not have any PowerPoint. No more PowerPoint performance scorecards. No more PowerPoint procurement dashboards. It all happens real time. It all happens through a portal on a cloud-based BI solution potentially. And people access the metrics that they want to access during the meeting on that actual screen. And so it eliminates all of the formatting and PowerPoint things, but it also makes it really hard to hide a lot of the things that might be wrong with the data. And so again, this idea of real-time data and using it in a different way. Now eventually we move away from any type of typing, any type of interfacing to this idea of a personal assistant. And I've got a picture of Amazon Echo here because this is something that's evolving where essentially you can ask it questions and it will respond to you. A lot of it similar to the way that Apple Siri works, but over time getting smarter, over time getting better and being able to learn the types of questions that you ask and respond to them. And so what does Procurement's virtual assistant look like? It helps us maybe guide buys. It helps us find suppliers. It helps us find commonly purchased items. It helps us answer frequently asked questions. And so this idea of making sure that we have this personal assistant, this virtual assistant in the future is going to be a big trend. We have to figure out how we're going to embrace it. Now, if we take a step back and think about this more tactically, in order to take advantage of any of these things and build out these future-looking solutions, we have to better understand our customer base, our stakeholders, our internal customers. We have to understand who they are, how they measure and think about success, how we're going to take action to improve the stakeholder experience. And for a lot of firms, this is actually a very formal methodology that they take, understanding their internal stakeholders. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, on the right-hand side here, you see a basic matrix of influence versus importance. And this was actually something that one of our clients shared with us, a procurement organization that actually segments their internal stakeholders based on their importance and their influence within the organization, to determine how they're going to interface with those stakeholders, who they're going to assign as account managers essentially. What tools are they going to give them access to? What type of turnaround times do you need to have? And a lot of us think about segmenting our supply base, but the idea here is applying that same level of rigor to your actual stakeholder base. And once you've done that, then aligning the right omni-channel personalized experience to them. Maybe for some folks, it's just going to be phone support or in-person help desk support. That's what works for them. That's what they need. For others, they require self-service. They want to go in, get the data, get out, and that's it. And so we have to understand that. And the better that we understand our stakeholders, the better we'll be able to put tools out there that are going to meet their needs in the future. Now, a perfect example of this idea of a virtual assistant is what we call guided buying in procurement. And guided buying is, this idea that you have multiple ways that you can source something, and you have multiple ways that you can buy it. Maybe you work with a strategic sourcing team to identify suppliers and go through a typical 7-step process. Or maybe you work with a buying desk, a tactical buying desk, that really is designed to make quick purchases that fall under a certain threshold. From a purchasing standpoint, maybe you're interfacing with a catalog. Maybe a buying desk is placing that order for you. Maybe maybe no system is required at all. Maybe you're making a phone call. And the idea here is to be able to help people navigate and find the right suppliers at the right time at the right price within your purchasing policy and building those rules into these solutions. And so we see guided buying, this idea of a personal assistant, as being the place where this is all going to start for our stakeholders. Now, let's talk a little bit about smart portfolio of digital services and what we mean by that, kind of our second pillar in the framework. Now, when we talk about a smart portfolio of digital services, there's a couple of things that, that we talk about first. First and foremost, going forward, it's table stakes at this point to have a 100% paperless process. No longer is 80 or 90% good enough. We all need to be at 100% paperless. This is table stakes going into the future. We also talk about creating procurement as a service and a portfolio of procurement services and what that means. So you think about being able to provide a portfolio of procurement services, the first thing it requires is an actual portfolio, a menu of what you do, and making sure that your stakeholders are aware of what procurement's capable of so they can select from that menu of services. They understand what they're going to get, how long it's going to take, and what the quality level is going to be. And so starting to think more about procurement as a service provider with a menu of services that you provide with branding and awareness and training around each of those services so that stakeholders can really draw from that, and ultimately you can increase your spend influence. And last but not least is this idea of taking advantage of robotics and eventually cognitive computing. We're going to talk a little bit about that because that's something that a lot of folks are interested in. So when we talk about robotic process automation, and for those of you that don't know what this is, I mean, essentially it's a way for software, not robots, software, to interface through the user interface, the same user interface that you use today in your tools across multiple applications. So let's say you have an order process, and maybe you've got to go into one tool to view the contract and one tool to view the order itself and another tool to view the invoice. And you have to do different steps along the way in 3 different tools. In the past, in order for those tools to be interfaced, if they weren't already interfaced from the provider, you had to do a lot of expensive underlying interface work and coding to bring them together. What RPA lets you do is work through those user interfaces and go from system to system and interface with the same way you would so that that underlying expensive interfacing isn't required. So it allows you to start to close really transactional gaps that maybe are very repetitive, that you're working across different systems and performing the same tasks over and over again. It allows you to do that and automate it. And so there's a lot of value here in how robotic process automation works. Now, there's a lot of outsourcing providers that are using this today to lower their own operating costs, to be able to automate things that they do for you, but do it at a lower cost. But the takeaway here is, why not think about how your own shared services centers can use this potentially? If you've already offloaded a ton of what you're doing in the transactional P2P into a shared service center or a center of excellence, they should be evaluating how they could use RPA potentially to really help close some of those gaps and make them more efficient and lower their costs. Now, when does RPA make sense? Well, when you have a stable, relatively static application. And what we mean by that is, a lot of times you've got a lot of legacy tools that are very hard to change, or maybe nobody even knows how to change it. And so these tools are perfect for layering on top of that to help perform and automate some of these tasks. If you need to access multiple systems, if you have a limited need for human intervention, and you have really high transaction volumes, and that's going to be key too. When you've got a really high transaction volume, it's a lot easier to justify the cost of bringing in a solution like this. Now, what we asked about in our purchase-to-pay key issues study last year, we asked a couple of questions, and one was, where are you at the RPA adoptions? And then, what are the benefits you're going to receive? And so one of the interesting things here is you look on the left-hand side, 77% of the companies came back and said, we don't have any RPA adoption today. And that's about what we would have expected. But what's interesting is 16% of all P2P organizations that we surveyed are piloting RPA, and 7% have partially rolled it out. And so that's a pretty significant number, actually, when you think about it. That 16% of all P2P folks that we talk to are piloting RPA today. So there is definitely a growing trend here that you need to pay attention to and see how you could maybe leverage the solutions. Now, in terms of benefits, we asked companies, what do you expect in terms of robotic process automation benefits? And the number one thing was operational efficiency, so productivity gains, then process cost reduction, then increased quality. And so for the most part, what you see here is that people are going into this thinking, how can I lower my cost? And that's what RPA is really focused on. But I would encourage folks to think broader than that. And what I mean by that is think about what this could mean to your workforce in general. By automating these tasks that are often mundane and repetitive, how can we take those people then and put them on more interesting things, make their own jobs more interesting, give them higher job satisfaction? And so there's a people element to this that I think is important that we consider. It's not that robotics are going to take the place of humans. It's not that the human workforce is going away, which I've seen in some publications, I think, which is wildly exaggerated. I think it's just the nature of our jobs will change over time, hopefully to become more interesting, more dynamic, and require more critical thinking. Now, in terms of RPA, we've kind of summarized for you in the slides, which everyone will receive, Hackett's point of view on RPA. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's one key takeaway here that's important. We view RPA as a stepping stone to more advanced cognitive computing. When we get to cognitive computing, the ability to actually have these machines think, recognize patterns, correct data, much in the way that spend analysis categorization happens today, right? To be able to really become more intelligent and perform more advanced tasks. That's what we view the future as. Now, RPA is an important stepping stone to getting there, but it's not the end point. It's not the end game. We view artificial intelligence as really being the end game here in terms of what we want to achieve. And so when you develop a plan and a roadmap for RPA, you want to think about that. How is this getting us closer to this ultimate goal of cognitive computing? So let's talk about creating a digitally enabled workforce. A big component of this future vision and future trends is having a workforce that can actually embrace it. Now, when we talk about digitally enabled workforce, there's a couple of elements to this. The first, and kind of the most basic, is making sure that we're giving people, especially millennials, access to tools and devices and platforms that they're familiar with, that look familiar to them, that they want to use. And so what this comes down to a lot of times is this idea of letting people self-provision their own IT assets. Now, I know a lot of sourcing and procurement teams get a headache as soon as they think about self-provisioning of assets because it can be more expensive, it's more complicated to maintain. There's a lot of challenges there, but ultimately, it's about making people more productive and giving them the devices that they need to do their jobs because they're going to do it anyways in some cases. So getting ahead of that, having a strategy for it, that's the simplest starting point in digitally enabling the workforce. But there's also this idea of modernizing training. we really need to focus on training going into the next decade and how we're going to change the way we deliver training and expect people to go through it. Now, there's a big trend out there right now on this thing called massively open online courses. And what this is you have the MITs and the Harvard of the world that have essentially made big parts of their curriculum free and accessible online, so that you can go and you can take a class on, say, logistics at MIT or business negotiations at Harvard and get a certification after that saying, okay, I took these classes and I have a Harvard certified, online, and this is really important to people, especially millennials, that they have access to this type of learning. So the idea here is to think about your training program and think about how you can take advantage of some of the things that are happening out there to enrich that training program. Gone are the days when we can sit people down in front of computer-based training classes for 2 weeks that were either developed internally or recorded, that are, really just not hitting the mark and don't give the bigger picture. We need to think broader, and that's where some of these online open courses can really help. Now, when we talk about digitally enabling the workforce, another thing that we have to acknowledge is the fact that video conferencing has come of age. A lot of CPOs that I talk to require video conferencing for all of their meetings. They require it for all their internal staff meetings. In this global environment that we work in, this idea of using video conferencing to better connect with people is really important. Now, what if, though, we took that same video conferencing, we took that same paradigm, and we applied it to how we interface with our suppliers also? What if we use video conferencing to help triage issues, to help work with our suppliers, to help to get to know them better? And so the idea here being is to take what we've done in video conferencing and to extend it out, make it bigger, work with our suppliers in the same way, make it pervasive. And I think this is going to be one of the trends that we really see in the future, that it's going to be everywhere. And I think a lot of organizations have already completely adopted it, but we really need to think about how we can extend it. Now, kind of related to that is if you look on the left-hand side of the slide here, you see this iconic picture of the United Nations in the box that they hold up to their ears when someone is speaking, and then someone in a booth actually translates in real time and it gets put through the lines and you can hear in your own language what people are trying to say. And that's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you actually have a tiny device that fits in your ear that's available now that will in real time hear the language that's being spoken to it and translate it into your native language right in real time and into your ear. And now, this is the type of change that we're talking about. And so what does this mean to procurement? Well, what if we took this translation technology and this supplier video conferencing idea, and we actually worked with our suppliers that are more comfortable speaking in their native tongue and allowed them to do that? South America and China. What if we were able to mash up translation services and the teleconferencing services to really, really collaborate with our suppliers in a new way? And so again, this future that the boundaries of communication are going to continue to fall on a global basis, and how do we get ahead of that and plan for it and think about it as far as a trend? Now, there's some best practices that we talk about all the time when we talk about talent management and procurement. And we like to share these in this context of digitally enabling folks. The first is that we really see the most effective training is conducted in the field, not in the classroom. The most effective training sessions are creative, they're engaging, they're challenging, they're based on real-life scenarios. So this idea of getting people out in the field, having them look over people's shoulders to learn is really important. The other best practice that we see is that staff is rotated within and between business units. And so increasingly, this is a strategy that we've seen in procurement to really help, which also really helps retain key people. And it's about getting them out into the world, getting them out not only on geographic rotations, but rotations within different business units, spending time in IT, spending time in finance, spending time in sales and marketing to broaden their experience, help them better understand the business. This is a really key part of a successful procurement and sourcing organization, and actually just a successful company in general. We also see, and kind of related to the previous point, we see procurement and sourcing increasingly recruiting and hiring outside of the traditional pool. So a lot of CPOs will say, you know what, I think we can train people on the basics of procurement. We can train people on the basics of a category. But what we can't always train is critical thinking, the ability to ask the right questions, the ability to walk the fine line with stakeholders between challenging their requirements, but also not being a bottleneck, and make sure you're actually being more of a trusted advisor. And so drawing from non-traditional pools of creative thinkers in procurement. And then ultimately, the cultures that are most successful in procurement are those that define themselves as successfully challenging the status quo. And here we talk about constructive disruptors. And I love this term because I think that's what we need to become. It's about constructively changing the way things are done today, but disrupting the status quo. So maybe you're deconstructing requirements to better understand them, to come up with co-sourcing or alternative sourcing ideas so that you're not single sourcing a solution. Maybe it's talking and working with suppliers around innovation or bringing it back to your stakeholders. It's about changing the status quo and just bringing something new to the table. So these are the characteristics that we see world-class procurement talent groups really characterize themselves with. Now, let's talk a little bit about networked solutions and unlocking value through this ecosystem. So what do we mean by networks? Well, we can mean a lot of different things. We can mean the network of your source-to-pay solutions. You know, how to spend analysis, talk to contracts, talk to your ordering system, talk to your invoicing system. How is it all glued together? What does that network look like? We talk about supplier and trading partner networks. I mean, historically, we always talked about supplier portals and supplier networks, maybe the ability to view an invoice or update an order. But really here, we want to think about the broader trading partner networks, including regulatory bodies, import-export compliance, logistics, carriers, as well as universities, consortiums, knowledge communities, bringing all of this rich information together in a single place to get better market intelligence, to have better risk management. We talk about crowdsourcing networks, and this is the idea of putting ideas out there or gathering ideas from the crowd on a solution, on the way to solve a problem. But it's also about farming out freelance assignments to crowds in this kind of freelance economy that people talk about. How do we take small bits of work and get it out there and get people bidding on it? How do we tap into the creativity of those networks? We talk about risk networks to better manage the interconnectivity of events, and I'll explain what I mean there. Enterprise social networks and the Internet of Things. So we're going to talk about a few of these areas in more detail. So what we talk about here is, and in this slide, we pasted in the graphics, so it looks a little wonky, but I think it's readable. We talk about all the different software solutions out there, and on the x-axis you have adoption phase, on the y-axis you have value. And in thinking about the way that you use all of these tools, what we're suggesting here is that you want to think about the level of maturity and adoption of some of the tools out there today, and really use that to help prioritize how you roll these things out. And what we mean by that is looking at fully adopted and high-value things in the right-hand corner, spend analysis, invoicing, eProcurement, contracts. These are the areas most companies start with. Further down and sort of in the second tier, we see companies focusing on things like savings dashboards, procurement savings tools, supplier lifecycle management and risk, and supplier networks. And so the point here is as you're thinking about your source-to-pay ecosystem of tools, start thinking about how you're going to prioritize in the future what you're going to be working on. And a lot of folks are focused on savings dashboards, lifecycle management tools, and supplier networks going into the future. So in the context of trends, that's where we see a lot of companies focused. Now, we have a report out there that the folks at Zycus can send you if you'd like on B2B networks, and certainly it talks about a lot of what's going on out there in these B2B networks. Now, another trend that we talk about with networks is this idea of how do we better manage tail spend through maybe a network of aggregators that aren't your traditional eProcurement tools. What do I mean by that? Well, you have solutions out there like Amazon Business, Alibaba, that are designed for e-commerce today for B2B. Now, you might have an eProcurement solution in place that helps you manage a lot of your strategic spend. You might have a buying desk in place that helps you manage, slightly less strategic spend. You may have catalogs in place and eProcurement tools that help fill the next gap. But what about tail spend? What about those infrequent purchases that are non-recurring spend that maybe fall below a certain dollar threshold? It's probably too expensive to put a solution in place for that non-recurring spend where you're really going to get the bang for your buck, but you want to have visibility to it still. You want to understand that spend and put some levels of basic controls around it. So what these spot buying or Amazon business type tools allow you to do is punch out essentially to these aggregators' catalogs. Put some level of control around the buy, but allow consumers or stakeholders to actually find and search catalogs and purchase what they need. And so this is a way of getting in front of folks that might be going and doing this anyways on their own, previously considered maverick spend, but putting some borders around it so that you know what's happening and you can report on it. This is a big future in the way that eProcurement, or big change in the way that eProcurement is working in the future. We also have this idea of networks that are much broader, and I mentioned this before. So not just supplier networks, but research centers, industry groups, internal business partners, government agencies, customers, universities, and schools, all coming together on a knowledge-based network where you can get better market intelligence. You can share information about suppliers. You can share information about categories. This idea of thinking about how do we extend our networks the way we think about them today into something much bigger and draw all these people together. When we think about the future and future trends, this idea of these bigger networks is a really, really important part of that. Now, there's also crowdsourcing networks and crowdsourcing and procurement. And so we talk about crowdsourcing, and this is a way to draw ideas and expertise from suppliers and customers or co-create on something that might be more innovative, new products, new markets. But increasingly what we're seeing is that folks are breaking off small chunks of work and using crowdsourcing networks as a way to essentially freelance out these projects. Now, in a lot of ways, this is working in a similar fashion to temporary labor, to the way you handle your contingent workforce today. And so in order to do this without actually introducing a ton more risk into your process, especially if you have IP you need to protect, is to think about this as just another channel for contingent labor, these crowdsourcing networks. And how can you break off small parts and essentially treat them like independent contractors? There's also this idea of interconnected risks, network solutions for interconnected risks. And what I mean by this is today, a lot of folks will think about a single event in time when they're trying to better manage risk. They might think about what's the probability and impact of a supplier going bankrupt, and how will we react to that? And that's good. It's good to have a plan in place. It's good to do that analysis. But very rarely is risk a single event in time like a bankruptcy. What happens in the real world is that you have a series of events that are interconnected that might lead up to a bankruptcy or might be the result of a bankruptcy, but there's a series of events like maybe a vulnerability in a supplier system or a leak of privacy information or a critical system outage or some sort of regulatory issue or supplier fraud or quality. And all of these things are interconnected. And so as we look into the future, what we have to think about are solutions and models that allow us to model the linkage of these events and how that adds up to a risk index. And how do we move that risk index in a positive direction? Not just reduce the risk of a single event, but of the entire interconnectivity of events. And as we think about solutions and software going forward, this is the type of capability that's required in the future, and a big future trend, because risk isn't going away, and it continues to get more and more prevalent. Now, we talk about enterprise social networks also in the context of networks. Being able to internally collaborate within your procurement team. What I've listed here is a few things that we use within our own advisory practice. We use Skype, we use Yammer, we use Slack. These are all tools to help us message folks, video conference, set up communities, be able to monitor, chatter, and different things that are going on in the company and get tied into it quickly. And so the idea here is, what tools are you using today, and is there room to grow? to help folks collaborate better within your own organization for enterprise social networking. Now, there's a lot of benefits of these tools. Sometimes it's the benefit of getting things out of email potentially, but it's the benefit of, for a lot of these millennials, giving them something that looks familiar that they use. The whole idea of enterprise social networking is it embraces the usability of Facebook, of LinkedIn, of things that people are familiar with in their personal social networking sites and bringing that home to the enterprise. So what's a good example of this? Well, think about it this way. On LinkedIn, you can join a community of interest. And you can see different things happening within that community. People post things that are relevant, specific to that group. But what if I could join a community at my own company that was specific to a supplier or specific to a category? So every time a new contract got updated for that supplier, or every time a performance scorecard was generated, or every time somebody started doing new business with the supplier, that all showed up within that supplier community that you have access to. This is a way of drawing together people from different parts in the organization that all need and understand, information about that certain supplier to share it in one place. So it's essentially this idea of creating these groups that are relevant to you where you can pull information versus it getting pushed to you. Now, last but not least, there's the Internet of Things. And you hear a lot of people talking about this. And essentially it's, if you think about what's happening with sensors, you think about telematics or people's watches being able to keep track of how many times they sit up and walk around during the day and remind them to get up again. It's this interconnectivity of all of these machines and people to help paint a different picture of the world. So how can we take advantage of this in procurement? Well, there's a lot of areas where this has really meaningful impact. Things like buildings and facilities and smart buildings. And how can we as procurement folks help develop a point of view on where the company should be going in terms of building an infrastructure? There's also inventory and inventory management, and certainly better getting a handle on what's in these storerooms and how can we ensure that we're not over or under ordering. There's also more intelligent asset management and pay for performance, and I think the key takeaway here is that procurement and sourcing need to be able to understand and speak this language to work with supply chain operations, to work with maybe your manufacturing sites, to work with your facility and real estate folks, just to ask the questions to say, what are you doing today, and are there ways we can be taking advantage of this? So let's talk about a couple of just kind of key wrap-up points here. So we talk about these factors shaping procurement's digital transformation. And each of these areas have their own trends that we see impacting them that are really impacting the future of procurement. This foundation of analytics and predictive information, this emergence of this omni-channel personalized stakeholder experience and all the tools that are required to do that, as well as the segmentation, the digitally enabled workforce, so the devices that people need, the emergence of new types of training, the smart orchestration, so robotic process automation, 100% paperless, and an ecosystem of network solutions, be it dealing with interconnected risks or creating a knowledge-based community and taking advantage of that to leverage new forms of market intelligence. Now, we always like to end with a quick kind of checklist for things that you might be considering. And are you ready for procurement's digital transformation? So on the stakeholder engagement, have you segmented your stakeholder base to understand what they need and want? Have you aligned that omni-channel interaction model with those needs and wants, giving folks information and support the way they need it when they want it? On the digitally enabled workforce, are employees able to self-provision? Are you giving folks access to devices they're familiar with, tablets? Has training been modernized to take advantage of new digital formats? And is there a plan to expand the way that video conferencing is being used to include suppliers, other trading partners? In digital service orchestration, are you looking at P2P to see are there transactional areas where RPA can help? Are you piloting it? Are you part of that 17%? We talked about that, creating a portfolio of procurement services. Have you done that? Do you have an evangelist within procurement that goes out and talks about these services, that educates your stakeholders on what you can do and quite frankly, what you can't, to generate demand, to help increase spend influence? Is there a vision for delivering procurement as a service? So this on-demand procurement as a service. On the digital networks, is there a vision for extending supplier networks to all trading partners? Is there a strategy for taking advantage of emerging technology here? Areas like savings dashboards, supplier performance and risk solutions. And ultimately, are you creating an insight-driven enterprise? So have you evaluated your current BI tools to understand their roadmap to cognitive computing? Where are they going? How are you going to get there? Do you have a plan in place to deliver predictive forecasting in areas like commodity volatility and risk? And ultimately, is mobility part of the overall strategy? Are you able to access real-time analytics on the fly? Are you moving away from PowerPoint to this idea of a real-time dashboard that's used in your meetings? So these are some of the key things that we think are really driving the future of procurement in the way that we do our jobs, this digital transformation framework. So we encourage folks to take advantage of this, and if you have any questions, we'd be absolutely happy to answer them via email. I think we've included some contact information here, both for the Zycus team and myself. You're welcome to write us, and we'd be happy to respond to any of your questions. And we hope that you got value out of today's webcast. So thanks very much, and with that, I'm going to pass it back to the Zycus team to go ahead and close us out.
Thank you, Patrick, for the wonderful presentation and the webinar. So attendees, as Patrick said, you can always write us the questions, and Patrick or someone from the Zycus team will pass on the questions to Patrick, and he will be answering all those questions for you. And after this webinar, we'll be forwarding the slides to you in a couple of days, slides along with the archive link for the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Patrick, for the wonderful presentation once again. With this, we end today's webinar and presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
What